So, I want to talk a little bit today about learned helplessness and how it applies to somebody who's grown up in an abusive or dysfunctional family or home environment. So, first, let me talk a little bit about what learned helplessness is. So, learned helplessness happens when somebody's exposed over and over again to some sort of negative or painful experience. And and it's a painful or negative experience that they can't escape from. So, what happens as a result of this being exposed again and again to a painful negative situation or experience the person can't escape from is they basically stop trying to escape, and they learn that they're helpless, that no matter what they do, they can't escape, they can't change the situation, they can't change the circumstances, and so they feel helpless, they feel powerless. And so this is what learned helplessness is. And to explain a little bit more about what that is, what that looks like, let me talk a little bit about the experiment that was initially done that helped us get the term learned helplessness. This experiment was done back in the 60s by a researcher named Martin Seligman. And what he did in this research was he had dogs in a cage, and the dogs were shocked while they were in the cage. So for one set of dogs, while they were in the cage and they were shocked, there was a way for them to escape. There was, I think, a wall on the side that they could jump over when they were shocked. So when the shock was administered, the dogs, to avoid the shock, quickly and easily jumped over this wall to escape. Now, in the one of the other groups, the dogs were administered the shock, but there was no way for them to escape. So this wall where the other dogs had been able to escape was blocked, and there was no way for them to escape. So obviously, what happened when they were first administered the shock was they panicked and were frantic, running around the cage, trying to figure out how do we get out, trying to jump, claw, do anything to get out. And eventually, after some period of time, they realized no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try, I can't escape. And then what happened is the dogs would give up. They would just lay down and just take the shock. They had learned helplessness, that no matter what I do, I can't escape, so I just have to take the pain. And the second part of this study is after this had happened and these dogs had learned this helplessness, what they did then is they did another part of the experiment, and they now placed these same dogs in these cages, except they put them in the cages where they could escape now. And what they found was that even when these dogs could escape, they no longer tried. They had learned that they were so helpless that even when they weren't actually helpless any longer and they could escape, again, they didn't even try. They didn't jump out of the cage. They could have avoided the shock now, but again, they had learned that they were helpless and they didn't even try. So now, if we take this back to thinking about a child who grows up in an abusive, dysfunctional family or home environment, this is a similar thing as what happens to the child. Is they're in a situation where there's negative experiences, there's pain, there's abuse, and this can take the form of any kind of abuse: neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, verbal abuse, um, which all create negative, painful circumstances and environments. And when a child is placed in that situation, they eventually learn, I'm helpless. No matter what I do, it doesn't stop. And children, like the dog, will try, like the dog in the experiment, will try all sorts of things to try to escape the situation. This is where such things like, if I'm really, really good, then maybe it'll stop. If I don't do anything to make daddy mad, he won't hit me, he won't hurt me. If I do really, really well in school, if I'm really, really quiet, if I I hide and he doesn't see me or she doesn't see me, then I won't get shocked, so to speak. Um, but kids learn eventually it doesn't matter what I do, it's still coming. The abuse is still coming, the dysfunction, the pain, the negativity is still coming. Unlike the dogs, they learn they're helpless, they're powerless. So children growing up in these environments have this learned helplessness. And then, like the dogs, what happens when they're actually out of their environments, when their parental homes usually, they've grown up, they're adults, they now are living on their own. And like the dogs in the experiment, they now are in the cages where they could escape. But because of the learned helplessness, the child who's now an adult um, still reacts like the dog did in the cage and takes further abuse and further pain and negativity and dysfunction and doesn't escape, doesn't do things that now are within their power to change their environment. And this can be seen in all sorts of ways. It can be seen in people getting into further abusive relationships and allowing that abuse to continue. It can be seen in people pleasing and codependency, in people not standing up for themselves, not speaking up for themselves, not exercising the power that they now have as adults. And part of how this comes and how this happens as well is as children, we don't have a lot of power. We are dependent on our parents. If we don't like our home environment, we at 5 or 8 or 10 or 12, even 14, 15, we can't just say, I don't like this. I don't like how you're treating me. I'm going to go take care of myself. We can't go get our own job at 5. We don't have our own money at 10 to support ourselves. And so we are trapped in a situation we can't escape from. But now, as adults, we are capable of getting our own jobs, making our own money. We're no longer dependent on somebody else to take care of us. And I realize some people are in situations where it's a little trickier. They don't maybe have all the resources to completely take care of themselves. But as adults, we are capable of doing things to help ourselves now. And there are resources we can use. Let's say we were in an abusive relationship. As adults, there are shelters and such things like that, the resources that we can use where there are ways we actually can escape now. But again, like the dogs in the experiment, the learned helplessness comes in. We feel like I can't help myself. I can't exercise my power. And this comes in big ways like leaving an abusive relationship, to smaller ways of speaking up for ourselves when somebody says something that I don't like. And part of what made me wanted to do this video today was I had a session with a client yesterday where we were discussing this exact principle. She grew up in an abusive, dysfunctional home and still has a lot of fear and learned helplessness in her relationship with her mother and her brother in particular. And the way that this was manifesting that we were talking about in this particular session was her brother was doing something that she didn't like, and instead of speaking up for herself, she completely froze. And even in the session when we were talking about even the thought of her speaking up to her brother brought up the helplessness and the powerlessness. And in the session, she could feel herself freezing. Her body was freezing. Her mind even froze. When she was trying to think of options, she completely went blank and couldn't think of anything. And so you can see, again, that learned helplessness. She was like that dog who was getting shocked and had learned that he couldn't escape. And so he just took it. And she was like that dog. I can't escape my brother's abuse. I just have to sit here and take it. So part of learning, growing, healing from the learned helplessness is first being able to identify that that's what's happening and being able to recognize that we are no longer helpless. or powerless, and we do now have the ability to make changes, to make choices for ourselves. And so, what we did in our session yesterday was I helped her to unfreeze, and we talked about options of things she could do besides freeze and stand still. And I helped her to come up with options because she wasn't able to do that on her own originally. So we talked about, rather than just standing there, she could walk out of the room. She could go to a different room. She could go to a different room, and if she was angry, she talked about maybe hitting pillows or screaming into a pillow to help her express the anger. We talked about maybe calling a friend. If she didn't feel safe in the home, she could go on a walk. She could take a drive. And you could see as we were talking, her body, and she described too, she unfroze. Her body was no longer frozen. Some of the anxiety and fear had calmed down. She was able to think a little bit more, and she felt relief. She felt better, as she remembered she's no longer powerless. She's no longer helpless. There are things that she can do, and this is important for any of us who've been in this situation to be able to start to learn to do, to recognize we're no longer helpless, we're no longer powerless, and then to start with the help of um, people we trust, whether that's a therapist or friends, help to start exploring options that we have, and little by little start actually exercising our power, so that we're not being helpless or powerless anymore. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a better understanding maybe of how and why you may be responding in the way that you do in your adult life. Because perhaps you have also learned this helplessness. The good news is that you can recognize it, and there are ways now to exercise your power. If you have any questions or want further information, um, feel, feel free to leave me a comment, send me an email on my website, and I would be happy to answer any of your questions, to maybe do a further video to explain as well. Thank you.